This is my presentation on the Supreme Court case Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. The essential question of this case is, does a law that limits the ability of corporations and labor unions to spend their own money to advocate the election or defeat of a candidate violate the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech? So the background to this case is that there were issues between films and disguised political ads. Films were allowed to be made with whatever political message they wanted to have. However, political ads were not allowed to be released within a certain time of the election and not allowed to have a certain backing from corporations, as to attempt to limit big money corporations from influencing the public's opinion of the election. So the two films that came to question were Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Perry, which was a film basically going against the re-election of George Bush after the 9/11, and it was voicing how upset people were with how he dealt with 9/11. And this case was ruled to be okay because Michael Perry was actually a film producer, and so it was ruled as just a film producer who was voicing his political opinion through his work. Citizens United, after Fahrenheit 9/11 was allowed, decided to release a film called Celsius 41.11, which is a obvious play off of Fahrenheit 9/11. And when it was brought to the Federal Election Commission, it was ruled that because Citizens United was a corporation, that this was not actually film because they were not a filmmaker. It was a disguised political ad. So the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act also has a lot to do with this case. It's also called BICRA for short. And BICRA did not allow for corporations to make films within a certain, or to make political ads within a certain time of the election, or to donate a certain amount of money, because they wanted to keep the elections from being, the public's view from being skewed due to big money. So then in 2008, Citizens United released a film called Preventing Hillary, the movie, which was basically a disguised political ad, some said, which is why there was an issue with it, and it was brought to the Federal Election Commission. So on January 21st, 2010, the Supreme Court had a 5-4 ruling, and the ruling, as quoted from the case, was that corporations, unions, and interest groups can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money for independent political expenditures. So basically, it was allowing for corporations to make whatever political ads they wanted, spend however much money they wanted on them, and release them whenever they wanted to. It was seen, part of the reasoning behind the ruling is that corporations are a group of individuals, and because individuals are protected by the Bill of Rights, then groups of individuals should be protected by the Bill of Rights, thus giving corporations protection under the Bill of Rights. So it was basically framed as protecting the First Amendment, and it allowed to use unlimited money for political speech, but direct donations were still restricted, so corporations couldn't just fund a political campaign, but they could do whatever they wanted indirectly, such as release political ads. So the judge's opinion, supporting Justice Kennedy presented his decision as basically that an attempt to prohibit funding was an example of censorship and wasn't allowing freedom of speech as allowed by the First Amendment. And then Justice Stevens, who was voted against the decision, said, and quote, that it threatened to undermine the integrity of institutions across the nation, and it would promote corporate power at the cost of the individual. So the dissenting side, basically, their argument was that once corporations' big money could get involved, it would not allow the election to be as pure, and it would allow more political or more financial influences in an election, which just didn't make it as even or as it should be. So the judges' opinions were decided as the supporting judges were Robert, Scalia, Kennedy, Thomas, and Alito, and the judges who were against the decision were Stevens, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Sotomayor. So the effects of the case, this case changed how corporations and unions could use money in campaigns and elections. So they had much more leeway, and it opened a door for much more influence because they weren't as restricted. And then it changed the ruling of two previous cases, Austin versus the Michigan Chamber of Commerce and McConnell versus the Federal Election Commission. And then also changed the effect that lobbyist groups and special interest groups could have in elections, and super PACs were formed. So it dives into big corporations who have a political candidate who might be able to help them out. They're able to donate a lot more money, and it's allowed a lot more lobbying to happen. My personal opinion on the case is that although I do understand both sides of the argument, I think it kind of boils down to a freedom and constitutional rights versus the government regulating and censoring. And I do understand the point for trying to limit big-time money and corporations in the political sphere, because that can get messy. But I think in the end that the freedom and constitutional rights of corporations should win out over that. So I support the ruling. Here's my works cited. The end.